Hello everybody again here for a very interesting presentation by A.Galpérine. We are very happy to get him here as a new president of ESTA France, and he will introduce us to the arrival of Viotti in Paris, and just give me a short attention for some announcements from right now. The lecture of Viotti can't take place because she is ill and her Zoom doesn't work accurately. So it will be cancelled this lecture at 3 o'clock. On the other hand, the two viola lectures will be separated from time, so George Alves will start at 2 o'clock and Axel Kircher will start at 3 o'clock, so you will have time really to go from one lecture to the other. And the reception in the town hall, the reception of the mayor, will not be like in the printed program announced at 4 o'clock, but it will start at 5 o'clock, so we have plenty of time to get there. Just one thing to make sure, you should have a proof of vaccination or recovery or a PCR test. Otherwise we can't get in to the town hall. Well, and now I'm really proud that A.Galpérine came here to our Congress, and please take over, and we are really curious to hear about it. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, Wolfgang. You don't know how happy I am to be this whole week with you for the 50th anniversary. You know, as you said, I'm the brand new French president of the French section, and so I'm learning a lot, you know, in this week, and I'm meeting everybody, and it's just, I can't tell you how happy I am about that, because I've heard of ESTA for a very long time, and I'm very touched at last to meet Geza, you know. And I've heard so much about him for many years, and I strongly believe in the mission of ESTA. You tell me if I speak loud enough. If not, you yell at me and you ask me to speak louder. You know, it's the emotion is also to be here in the south of Austria. I remember a few years ago, I was in Gorizia. I was in the jury of the Pizza competition in the north of Italy. And, you know, getting out of the hotel, in a few meters, we were in Slovenia. And I could see, you know, the sign of the road to Vienna. And to be in the north of Italy, that's where where everything started for us, you know. I'm sorry, I'm just going to talk about violin, but for our string instruments, we all know that everything started in the north of Italy. So I was in Gorizia and I saw the road to Vienna, and on the other side of the north of Italy, the road to France. And that's what we are going to talk about that. It's strange for me to be in Austria, not to talk about Schubert, about Mozart, about Leopold Mozart, you know, who was such an important man for, you know, the development of violin. But we are going to talk about France and about Viotti. And when Wolfgang asked me if I had a topic for a lecture, you know, for the 50th anniversary of ESTA, which is a big thing, you know, I wasn't going to decide to talk about the arrival of Giovanni Battista Viotti in Paris. You know, he started his action in 1795, just after the end of the Revolution, or nearly the end of the Revolution. So what's such a topic? Well, we all know that the action of Viotti in the French capital is generally associated with nothing less but the birth of modern schools of violin playing and teaching. Yes, we all know that. And believe me, I don't have the pretension to teach you anything. But I've noticed, and maybe you have noticed the same thing, that most of our students are very ignorant about history of violin. I'm not saying that we should be scholars or historians, but at least to know some big dates of evolution, sometimes revolution, in the art of playing and teaching violin. That's why I thought it was interesting to think about, not only about Viotti, but about his legacy, you know, which opens a new chapter in the destiny of violin. Actually, I'm talking about our students, but I must confess that when I was a kid, you know, a young kid, you know, my grandmother, who was my first teacher, would put on the music stand Kreutzer, and Rod, Pierre Rod, caprices, you know. Of course, Viotti concertos, some solo de concert of Pierre Bayou. And I had no idea who these guys were. And actually, I didn't give a damn about it, I must say. You know, I was just practicing and, you know, and I didn't know anything. And sometimes I find out that many at least, of our students are very ignorant about some very important dates of the history of violin. So, another thing I want to say, we are going to talk about the arrival of Viotti in France. Do I consider that at that time, Paris was the center of the world? Of course not. Of course not. Please, believe me, I'm not a French nationalist. Please believe me, I'm not a chauvinist. And I know very well, especially what's going on in Vienna, you know, and in Middle Europa in general. But I chose to talk about Viotti because, yes, the topic is important. And I'm not going to talk about that just because I'm a Parisian and because I teach in Paris Conservatoire. But that's a little bit the reason why I want to talk about Viotti, because we are going to see that the legacy is very closely related to the history of Paris Conservatoire also. But, you know, when I said I'm not a French chauvinist, I'm not going to talk just about France. If I talk about France at that time, it's because the influence of Viotti is going to spread out all over the continent. And that's exactly what we are going to talk about. And I think it's a good thing to have that in mind, you know, for our 50th anniversary of European string teachers. And Viotti is sort of a grandfather for all of us. So it's interesting because Viotti arrives in Paris just, as I said, just a little bit after the revolution. But Paris is still, you know, in the storm of the revolution. It's interesting to make a connection between the political events, you know, the big storm, not only in France, but, you know, all the new ideas at the end of the 18th century, which are spreading over everywhere. And there is a sort of revolution in violin. Strangely enough, you know, is there a connection? I don't know, but it's striking to see that at this moment of revolution, we have a sort of a revolution in the art of playing violin. Well, we could say the same thing between the transition between pianoforte and piano, as we know. You know, there are developments, of course, for cello and, you know, and for viola. We could, you know, and it's a time of big transformations. The organ, for example, there's an enormous gap between Baroque organ and Romantic organ. You know, but anyway, we can close the parenthesis. It's just interesting to see that what's going on in Paris politically has also an incidence, it seems, on big transformations on our art of violin playing and teaching. So the first question we ought to ask is, what makes Viotti such an important figure in the world of violin? Why is he a sort of grandfather, I said, a sort of biblical patriarch for all modern violinists? And which points, technically and musically, can we focus to figure out the real reasons of such an influence, of such a great example spreading out all along the 19th century? You probably know the story of Johannes Brahms accompanying Joseph Joachim in Viotti 22nd Concerto. You know, it's a well-known story. And Brahms was overwhelmed by the beauty of this music. Well, let's confess that we're a little bit surprised. I mean, sure, the 22nd Concerto of Viotti is a beautiful piece, and sure, Joachim played it beautifully, no doubt about that. But Brahms' reaction seems nowadays enormous, you know. How a composer of the dimension of Brahms could show such an enthusiasm to the point of deciding that he would compose himself his own concerto. You know, it's difficult nowadays to fully understand such an impact of Viotti's compositions. Sure, that's beautiful, but you know, such an impact is quite remarkable. There's just one explanation. The eloquence, the expressiveness, the irresistible expressiveness of the instrumental writing. An instrumental writing which seems to have established a standard of style and technique arrived at full maturity. To have given a grammar, a vocabulary, inspiring enough to push some major composers like Brahms to decide right away that they wanted to write for the violin. But what is the nature of this new grammar? We are talking about a revolution on which aspects of the mechanism of violin can we focus to understand what is truly original in Viotti's playing and teaching. Why such an impact? Well, let's go back to the end of the 18th century. Viotti was born in Vercelli, in the north of Italy, and in 1782 he made a tour in France with his teacher, a man from Torino, Gaetano Pugnani. Apparently, the tour was an enormous triumph, and the success, especially in the famous Concert Spirituel, the great Parisian series, gave to Viotti the idea of establishing himself in Paris. He went on performing a lot, but started also a huge activity as a pedagogue. His reputation grew to the point where he was appointed director of Paris Opera House. So all the testimonies, I wouldn't call them reviews at that time, but all the testimonies we have point out one essential quality. They all say large sound with a unique power of expressivity. The impact of such a power can be measured by reading just a few words written by Pierre Baillot. Pierre Baillot, I don't know if this name still rings a bell, you know, it's a bit forgotten. Pierre Bayot was one of the first Viotti's teachers, and a very important man. We're going to see why. And you know what he said? Talking about Viotti, we have found our Jupiter. We, the violinists, we have found our Jupiter.
We have?
The chief of gods. Bayot is a little bit forgotten today, but he was the intellectual of a group formed by a famous trio, Pierre Rode, also student of Viotti, and Rodolphe Kreutzer. The three men were playing with Viotti in the Chapelle du Premier Consul, chapel of the first consul, Bonaparte chapel. Then in the Chapelle de l'Empereur, chapel of Napoleon. Rode was also one of the favorite pupils of Viotti, and Kreutzer, who was first a student of Stamitz in Mannheim. And that's important to know because if Viotti is a great ancestor for modern technique, he's not the only one. Yeah. But Kreutzer, coming from Stamitz, was extremely impressed by Viotti's teaching. And Kreutzer, Rode, and Bayot were the first teachers of the brand new Conservatoire. The Conservatoire, an institution created, as you know, by the revolutionary governments. You know, at the revolution, the authorities asked they wanted to build big schools like Polytechnic, like the Conservatoire, and many schools of engineers, of anything. And the authorities asked for official books, in the spirit of the encyclopedia in the 18th century, for each activity. And Bayot had to write the official method of the Conservatoire. And this book is just Viotti's principles. And Kreutzer and Rode, I have to tell you, didn't write books, but they wrote concertos and studies and etudes, which are still on our music stand, as you know. And like Viotti concertos, That's a question I've been asking myself, why are we still working on Kreutzer etudes and Rode's etudes, Isn't it old-fashioned? No, it's not old-fashioned. That's basic of technique, modern technique. What's interesting is that, I did some research a little bit for this lecture, and I found out that Viotti, in fact, stayed 12 years in Paris, nothing more. And that's a very short time for establishing such an influence on violin playing. So, and then, it's funny, he went to London and started a business of selling wine. And apparently his business was not successful, so he sort of came back to Paris and started teaching again. The man was very modest. And it's interesting because all that we know about Viotti, we know it through his students. I was mentioning Bayot, who wrote about that, but there were others also. Viotti seems to be a bit like Socrates, who didn't write a line, and Plato was writing everything he said. So most of what we know about Viotti comes from the writings of his students. But the influence was so big that you understand why in the years 1800, I'm describing Paris as a very important center. So Viotti would be famous just for a large and generous sound? Of course not. It's more complicated than that. After all, at the end of the 18th century, the Parisian scene was already very rich. You could hear Jean-Marie Leclerc, you could hear Mondonville, you could hear Gaviniès, I don't know if you know this name, if you are still practicing his matinees, his studies, And all these violinists were very successful. So, but Viotti, it is special. The success was special. it has a rational explanation. It seems that this great maestro is the one who really built a kind of technique fully adapted to modern times. His time, of course, but also, and above all, the times to come. And that's why his great example has got such a dominating position all along the 19th century, I said it, and later on. He represents a sort of highest point of Italian schools, the ultimate element of a glorious chain going back to the origins of the instruments. As you know, it's interesting to know that in the first 100 years of the history of violin, there were three categories, three centers of attraction, very characterized and specific. The French violinists were inspired by the spirit of dance. That was their main expertise. The Germans were always close to the organ, and they were masters of polyphony, interested in the polyphony of the instrument. Of course, these categories are very general and maybe superficial, but basically there's something. And the Italians had an obsession, the ben cantare, the singing qualities of the instrument. The instrumental family of string instruments should get as close as possible as human voice. You know, and during the 18th century in Paris, there were big fights, big quarrels between the supporters of the Italian influence and the supporters of the French influence. The supporters of Corelli and the supporters of Lully. The Italians are going to win the war at the end of the 18th century. The Italians have won the war. But it's interesting, the Chorale des Italiens, the big fight of the Italians, is interesting because it concerns directly violin. Corelli had dreamed of the ben cantare, and the Lully supporters were in favor, of the heavy down bows and the dancing qualities. They did not try to hide anything in the up bow and down bows. And Corelli had this dream of ben cantare, and you begin to see what I'm going to say about Viotti, because Viotti is also, all the testimonies of the time show that he's obsessed with the ben cantare in a different aesthetic, but that comes from that. There is another big fight in Paris named the Querelle des Bouffons in the 18th century, Quarrel of the Bouffons. I don't know how to translate in my airport English, but that was between the followers of Rameau in favor of harmony and the followers of the philosopher Rousseau in favor of melody. That doesn't concern specifically the violin. Rousseau admires Gluck, the new German operas, and is, on the Italian side, against Rameau. Sure, Rameau is a much greater composer than Rousseau, but philosophically, what's interesting is that Rousseau is anticipating on what's going to be called Romanticism. He foresees what Romanticism is going to be. So what is Romanticism? Viotti is not a romantic composer, but he's certainly, all his students are the archetypes as a romantic soloist. Viotti leads to that, So what is at the beginning of the 19th century in Paris, when Viotti is teaching, it's the beginning of Romanticism in a way, let's call it that way, even if it's going to arrive a little bit later. So what is Romanticism? As I said, it's not the cliche, the usual cliche, of a boy and girl on a Californian beach looking at the sunset, That's not what it is. Romanticism is going to be a few different things. First of all, the triumph of melody. For violinists, it's obvious. That's why actually the polyphony is pretty poor in our repertoire in the 19th century. At the end of the century, it's going to come back, of course. But at the beginning of the 19th century, of the Romantic period, melody is everything. Of course, the virtuosos don't play only their music at that time. They start playing, being performers of written music, of somebody else. And as we know, the Romantic virtuoso is giving his inner life, he's saying I. This is a big difference, of course. And he has to stick to what's written. And of ornamentation, and of all that. In a way, as I said, Viotti is going to give the grammar for this new aesthetic, this new mission of the virtuoso. So, as I said, I don't know if we can put Viotti in the category of romantic soloist. He's more representative of the 18th century Italian tradition, but certainly leads to it. He's a man preparing all the elements, technically and stylistically, which will make possible the rise of modern virtuosos. So, as I said, is it just a question of large sound? No. But we cannot understand anything about Viotti's revolution if we don't talk about another revolution among the luthiers and the bow makers in Paris at that time. As I said, there is an extraordinary genealogy. Corelli, Somis, Pugnani, Viotti. That's a chain. In a way, Viotti is going to fulfill the dream of Corelli 1 century later. This chain, Corelli, Somis, Pugnani, Viotti, is one of the most glorious in our history. It's interesting to know that Somis, great violinist from Torino, also Turin, was famous for his son filet, the endless melody of the bow. In the 18th century, that kind of technique of son filet was the most astonishing thing to hear. It was supposed to be the most difficult thing to realize with a bow. So, I could talk also about Tartini, the School of Nations in Padova. All these schools all go in the same direction, the ben cantata. And even in the spiccato or sautiller articulations, it should always be singing. All the Viotti students are going to say that. But we have to talk about the revolution of the luthier and the violin and the bow maker. Why? Well, you understand why. I don't have to say why. But what's important to know is that at the beginning of the 19th century, Italy is tired of being the center of the world. Italy is exhausted to be, la Mecca of the arts since the Renaissance. And somehow, Viotti's arrival in Paris is a moment where Italy sort of passed the flame to the French. And that's true for pedagogues, that's true for virtuosos, that's true for luthiers. And it's important to know that it's impossible to understand what's going on if we don't imagine Viotti spending hours in the workshop of François-Xavier Tourte. The man who is supposed to have invented the new bow, the new shape, and Viotti was asking not only a firm tip, but a maximum of hair at the tip. And he would work for hours with this man. And he's supposed to have inspired some of the big transformations. And that's also, you know, the firm tip was not only for making martellato, to have this proud style of playing that Viotti apparently had, but also it was at the service of the infinite melody, endless melody, to quote a Wagnerian expression, you know. And, you know, it always goes in the same direction. It fulfilling the dream of Corelli. And after all, you know, we all use the tourte bow nowadays, and, you know, we fight every day, you know, to have a smooth, you know, gesture of the bow at the frog, at the tip, not losing sound at the tip, and so on. Of course, what's fascinating in what Viotti students explain, that it's going to be a real science of how to use the bow, how to divide all the parts of the bow, how to use each part of the bow, you know. Not just 1 week before coming here, students showed me a book of Dancla, Charles Dancla, maybe you know his etudes, you know, who are still used for children. Dancla was also a student of Bayeux, also teaching in Paris Conservatoire. And Dancla, this book is absolutely fascinating. He wrote everything about Viotti principles and what Viotti wanted. So it's absolutely amazing. This passage, you see, not quite at the front, a little bit there. At the middle, not quite at the tip. Really at the tip. Here, poco, larger amount of bow. Everything is described. And of course, also the fingerings, the shifting on one string. And how Viotti mastered also playing in high positions without shifting, to be as comfortable in sixth position as in the first position. In the line of, you know, maybe you know the divertimento of Campagnoli. Each divertimento is in one position. Apparently Viotti was obsessed with, you know, the line to be able to play in one position without shifting, but also being able to shift on one string, you know. So we see that it's not just a question of getting a large sound with a tourte bow. It's a real science. So as I said, you know, all that we know about Viotti's teaching, we know it through his disciples, his students. Just a word about the violin makers. The most famous French violin makers of that time, Lupo, you know, Pic, the Villon family. I'm playing a Villon. And of course all these guys, you know, like violinists, like Leclerc, like all these guys went to Italy to learn. You know, and that's true, of course, of the Austrian and the German violin makers, you know, were all children of Italy. But what's happening in Paris at that time, and Viotti was a militant of this transformation, is that all the magnificent instruments of the 18th century had a surgery. The fingerboard, you know, you all know that, was going to be longer, to, you know, going up towards the bridge. And for the table of the violin to support such a pressure, the violin makers put a big piece of wood under the table, you know, so that, you know, the violin wouldn't crash. So you see, instruments were going to be much more powerful, and that's the idea of this luthier, you know, at that time. Are we in favor of that kind of surgery? At that time, no doubt, everybody thought it was an improvement, and certainly it's an improvement for some repertoire. Well, we all know that nowadays, if we want to play Baroque music, it might be more interesting to have a real Baroque instrument with a real bow at that time, you know. All these questions are, you know, endless. So I would, about this revolution in violin making, I will give the last word to a man that I admire very much, and you too, I imagine, is Nicolas Harnoncourt. Harnoncourt, I don't know how to pronounce that the proper way, I pronounce the French way, certainly the most intelligent and profound analyst of these questions. His answer is very simple. It is worthless, he says, to choose one side on the battlefield. You get on one side and you lose on another side. You know, sure, the violins Viotti was in favor of, the new luthier, you know, and the new violin transformations, we're going to give more power. The modern romantic soloist is there, he's coming. And sure, we lose the wonderful harmonic richness of the, you know, of the Baroque instruments, which didn't have the surgery of this big stick of wood under the table, you know. And that's it. Harnoncourt's perfectly right. The only thing we should not ignore is what happened. You know, what is a modern instrument? What is a Baroque instrument? What is the story of all that? For which repertoire is it meant? You know, the Baroque instrument will freeze resonance with the Baroque bow, which is going to be played much more in the lower part of the bow. Of course, Viotti is developing, you know, the upper part of the bow. You know, then we can choose an aesthetic. We can choose what we want, but we cannot ignore that. That's what I keep telling my students. Please, I'm not asking you to be big scholars, to be big historians, but at least to know some big things. Anyway. Once again, I must apologize because all that I'm talking about, you know it already, but as I said, our students have to be more aware of all these questions. So we said that modern schools were at the service of modern music. Well, this is normal. It has always been the case. And we know that art and technique are always marching on the same rhythm in a way. So what is modern music in Paris in the beginning of the 19th century? Beethoven, and Beethoven. Very simple. Among students, the students of Viotti, remember we find Bayeux. Bayeux premiered in France Beethoven quartets, all Beethoven quartets. And also the concerto. I have in my hands his music with his fingerings and bowings of this premiere. You know, it's very, very, very interesting. He changed a few things with the text. It was not still the fashion of old text, but you know, basically it was close to the text. Pierre Rode, another student of Viotti, I was talking about, as you know, premiered Beethoven 10th Sonata. In the middle of Napoleonic War, he was appointed first violin at the chapel of the Tsar, Alexander I. And on the road to St. Petersburg, he stopped in Vienna and apparently had dinner with Beethoven. I don't have to mention Kreutzer Sonata, of course. You know. So all these people in Paris at that time were the champions of Beethoven music. Beethoven is supposed to be the man who refused to play the sonata dedicated to him. Apparently we are not so sure about that. You know, when I was young, I was always told, Kreutzer was an idiot, you know, he did not understand this music. Apparently we are not so sure that he got the music, you know. But anyway, Kreutzer is an idiot forever, because he's a man who was supposed to have refused Kreutzer sonata. Another student of Viotti should be mentioned here. I don't know if you know this name, he's a bit forgotten. He's of German origin. His name is Habneck. If you read Berlioz's memoirs, you can see that he appears at every page. Habneck, a violinist, student of Viotti, and who wrote a book about Viotti principles. Habneck premiered all Beethoven symphonies in Paris, including the violin concerto with Baillot as a soloist, he was conducting. He founded the famous Société des Concerts du Conservatoire, the ancestor of the Orchestre de Paris, and was Viotti's successor as director of the Opera House. Habneck concerts, where people were discovering Beethoven symphonies, like Baillot's chamber music evenings, where people were discovering the quartet, attracted the whole romantic world. No one would have missed these magic moments where Beethoven masterpieces were heard for the first time. Berlioz was certainly the most enthusiastic, of course, but Chopin, Liszt, or the great painter Ingres wouldn't miss these concerts. I'm mentioning Ingres, the great painter, because Ingres was an amateur violinist who took a few lessons with Paganini. And, he gave us this wonderful portrait of Paganini. After a lesson, he did a sketch of Paganini. And the greatest joy of Ingres was to play Kreutzer Sonata with Liszt on the piano. That's the kind of scene, of romantic Parisian scene, I was saying that Italy was tired of being the center of everything. Viotti and Paganini arrived in Paris, Paganini a little bit later, but in this first part of the 19th century, they are the big figure. It is as if Italy was sending two ambassadors, the last ambassadors of the great Italian traditions. Paganini, of course, keeps from himself all his secrets. I know his capricci are dedicated to the artist, but on stage, everybody was trying to understand what's going on, how he could do that. Viotti is the opposite. Viotti gives everything. He builds a dynasty. He's the grandfather, as I said. So, I would like to talk about the students of Viotti. That's extremely important because that's going to show how his influence is going to spread out all over the continent. So I talked about Baillot, about Holt. I saw the name Pixis. Pixis is going to be a great teacher in Prague. And I saw the name Robrecht. Robrecht, you have probably forgotten who he is. I don't know this man, I must say, but he's very interesting. Robrecht is the first Belgian violinist to come to Paris to study with Viotti. Robrecht was the master of Charles de Berlioz. Berlioz was the master of Henri Viotin. And Viotin was teacher of Eugene Isaïe. All right. We see clearly the chain of the so-called Franco-Belgian school. Now let's remember that Viotin established himself for a while in St. Petersburg, where he taught intensively, and we can foresee the beginning of Russian schools. And since we are talking about the Belgian violinist, we should mention Léonard, who was the teacher of Marsic, Léonard, student of Habneck. Obviously, the Viotti legacy. He was the teacher of Marsic. Marsic, maybe you don't know the name, is very famous violin teacher in Paris Conservatoire in the 19th century. And you know who we find in Marsic class? Karl Flesch, George Enesco, Jacques Thibault, not bad, Another Belgian figure in Paris Conservatoire, Lambert Massa. Massa was a student of Holten. Who do we find in his class? Fritz Kreisler, Henryk Wieniawski. All that comes from the same roots of modern technique. Aaron's genealogy is quite fascinating. Let's go on. Among Rhodes' students, we find Jacob Böhm. And since we are in Austria, we should have a special attention on this name. It shows Rhodes' legacy in the Austro-Hungarian Empire and more generally in Middle Europe. Among Böhm's students, we find Jakob Dont, Heinrich Wilhelm Ernst, George and Joseph Helmersberger, Joseph Joachim. Interesting, isn't it? Let's mention also the influence of Rode on Ludwig Spohr, great founding master of the German school. Let's go on. Among Joachim's students, we find the great Hubauer. Among Hubauer's students, we find Steffi Geyer, Joseph Szigeti, or the incredible chain of illustrious Hungarian masters. I'm not saying that to be nice together. We all know the importance of Hungary in that story. It's interesting to see that, we follow all these lines. Now let's remember that Jakob Dont was a master in Vienna of Leopold Auer. Is it necessary to insist on the importance of this man? Let's just remember some of his students, Jascha Heifetz, Michael Mann, Zimbalist, and we know that Milstein in his class too. Okay, although Milstein was coming from all this, but he spent time with Auer in Petersburg. So this great figure of Russian school also emigrated in the United States and had a big influence in New York. An influence I could still feel when I was in New York myself, years later. Also a word about the famous man, Otakar Ševčík, student of Benowitz related to Pixies. Again, direct line to Viotti. And Otakar Ševčík was a master of Jan Kubelik. What's interesting, these lists of names, which are very incomplete, tell us many things, but they show particularly that in a few generations, we make an incredible journey from Viotti to nowadays. I could give you an example, you're going to laugh, forgive me, I'm going to talk about me. It's a very interesting topic. Forgive me. When I was in New York, in the Juilliard School, my teacher was Ivan Galamian. Galamian was a student of Mostras in Moscow and Lucien Capet in Paris. He was constantly referring to Capet's legacy, especially about bow technique. Capet was an extraordinary quartet player, specialist of Beethoven. They were all obsessed by Beethoven. And Capet was a maniac, he was dividing the bow into 32 pieces, and you had to play exactly, at that part of the bow, crazy. Interesting, but a bit crazy. But for Galamian, he was God. And he was certainly a great musician, that's absolutely sure. So it's interesting, Capet was saying that in a few names we arrive to nowadays. Capet was a student of Jean-Pierre Morin, a French violinist of the 19th century. Morin was a student of Bayeux. So in four names, I studied with a man who studied with Capet, who studied with Morin, who studied with Bayeux and Viotti. In four names. I found that fascinating. Then I studied with Heinrich Schering, student in Berlin of the legendary Karl Flesch. And I've heard so many things about Flesch. I met Ostal, I know very well the Flesch legacy. And and I've almost a feeling I've known him. Let's say a word, about Enesco. Enesco, who is a legend in Paris. And Enesco, I heard many things from Menuhin and from Christian Ferras. I was with Menuhin when we visited the humble house Enesco had in the suburb of Paris in Meudon, and Menuhin was showing the room where he learned the chaconne for the first time, where he played Frank Sinatra for the first time, That's essential. Enesco is, of course, very important, because he's a bridge between Vienna and Paris. That's what we're talking about. He was a student of Helmersberger, Joseph Hermesberger, and a student of Marsic, who, by the way, premiered the first Saint-Saëns sonata. So it's sort of a bridge between the East and the West of Europe, and as comfortable as possible in all these different universes. It's just very interesting. So we see the way Viotti's legacy spread out all over the continents, And I think that justifies the desire I had to choose such a subject for the 50th anniversary of our association. Of course, I guess that this game of genealogy, we could do it in many countries. That was not my topic, so I didn't talk about the action of Geminian in London, for example. We could talk about many genealogies, but it's interesting, to see in the case of Viotti how the whole continent was, if I may say so, contaminated, by his influence. So I guess I should finish now, because time is going. We could talk endlessly about all that. I wanted to point out the importance of knowing all that, because we all know that repertoire has opened drastically. It was not the case when I was young. Baroque music was Bach, completely revised, of course. A few Vivaldi concertos, and that's about it. Modern music, when I was with Galamian, would stop at Prokofiev. Okay, I'm exaggerating a little bit. Some went to Bartok, some to Bartok and to Alban Berg. But, that didn't go any, the repertoire that didn't go any further. The repertoire is now so huge. We go to Bieber, to Boulez, and I'm personally completely allergic to violinists who play all the same. They put the same fingering, the same technical means on a Corelli sonata or a Boulez or a Schoenberg piece. That doesn't make any sense. So I'm a strong militant of a little bit of knowledge of history. And so the idea is just to develop our imagination, knowing that's a famous expression. And maybe we can end with these words, knowing where we are coming from, who we are, and where we are going to. That's why I think to have a minimum of historical knowledge about the story of our violin, first of all, it's so beautiful. It's like a novel, when I read about all these great masters, it's like reading a novel. But I think it's important nowadays that repertoire is so huge to have good information. I know that we can find anything on the internet, but most of my students, are a little bit lost in the amount of information. So I think that sticking to a few dates with a few names we gave today helps a lot to understand how to perform a Slavic concerto or Italian sonata, a German sonata, or a Fauré or Franck or Debussy sonata. A minimum of culture is not luxury. We need it. And that's what I'm trying to do as a teacher. Because that's related to some very precise technical principles. Okay, I think we can end with these words. Where are we coming from and where are we going to? And if you want to ask some questions, I could try to answer. But as I said, I'm not a historian or a musicologist. I'm a violinist. I've been playing violin my whole life and teaching violin. And so I'm not pretending to be a scholar in the history of violin. I'm just saying that we should know a few things very precisely.